I just wanted to share with you some thoughts on capital and corporal punishment in Islam. This is a subject about which there is much misinformation in the West, and even some Muslims perhaps misunderstand it. I'm going to read a passage from Prince Ghazi's book, A Thinking Person's Guide to Islam, the essence of Islam in 12 verses from the Quran. I think his discussion of corporal and capital punishment in Islam is particularly balanced and holistic, and I just wanted to share it with you. He writes, returning now to the question of capital and corporal punishment, the first thing to be said is that these form less than 1% of Shariah laws, and probably less than 0.1%. In the Quran itself, there are only 5 offences that warrant capital or corporal punishment: murder, theft, adultery, fornication, corruption upon the earth, and calumny against the virtue of women. So capital and corporal punishment are not the essence or the goal of the Sharia, as some people seem to think, and as hostile stereotypes depict. It will also be clear that although there is both capital and corporal punishment in Islam, there are legal subtleties about them that make them, and are supposed to make them, far different in practice than they are in theory, and very difficult to implement. In theory, there is capital punishment for only 3 cases: premeditated murder, adultery for married people, and apostasy with treason. The Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, said, "The blood of a Muslim person who testifies that there is no God but God, and that I am his messenger, is never licit to shed except for one of 3 cases: a soul for a soul, married adultery, and passing through religion and leaving the community." It's a hadith found in Bukhari and Muslim. Capital punishment for murder is akin to the biblical lex talionis. In nations where people will naturally take revenge for the loss of close relatives, no matter what any law says, lex talionis not only enforces justice and acts as a deterrent, but also saves lives by preventing long blood feuds where many people on both sides are likely to die. Indeed, God says in the Quran, "In retaliation there is life for you, O people of cause, so that you might fear." Surah Al-Baqarah 2:179. As regards the question of apostasy, this too is a biblical law found in Deuteronomy 13:6-9 and 17:3-5. And Luke 19:27 has been misunderstood to allude to it. However, despite the classical usuli position, some contemporary usul scholars have said that the punishment is for high treason, not apostasy alone. There are 4 reasons for saying this. The punishment is not actually mentioned in the Quran as such. The Prophet is recorded as having let a Muslim who apostatized go free. C. Prior to modern nation-state system, leaving a religion was actually leaving your state, and hence high treason. And D. The hadith quoted above specifies leaving the community together with apostasy. As regards the punishment for married adultery, it is here where the greatest confusion occurs. This punishment, which is also not mentioned in the Quran, although it is mentioned in Leviticus 20:10 in the Bible, is accepted by scholars as being stoning to death. The key point here is that under Sharia law, whilst the punishment for adultery is not questioned by scholars, it is virtually impossible to implement, except if someone voluntarily insists on confessing, and in some traditions even confession per se may not constitute decisive proof. If we look at the history of Islamic law, we see this very clearly. The two places where traditionally usul-based Sharia law was implemented over the most number of people for the longest period of time were Egypt from the 7th to the 19th centuries across various different ruling dynasties, and the Ottoman Empire from 1299 until 1923. During that time, Egypt started with a population of 8 million, and this declined over the centuries for various reasons to around 3 million. The Ottoman Empire had a population of between 11.7 million and 35 million over its history. During 1,200 years of Sharia rule in Egypt, there were only 2 documented cases of stoning for adultery, and both of them were technically illegal and politically motivated. One occurred during Sultan Qaitbay's reign, 1422 to 1438, when a female slave in the Sultan's household was hanged for having an affair with a soldier. The other occurred in 1513, when Sultan Kanshul executed a deputy judge and his lover, another judge's wife. The couple were probably guilty, and there was not sufficient evidence to try them with charges of adultery. The Sultan at first sentenced them to death by stoning, but the judiciary protested, so he just hanged them, without a basis in Sharia law. Similarly, during the entire period of the Ottoman Empire, there was only one confirmed case of stoning because of adultery. In 1860, a qadi, that's a judge, ruled that a Muslim woman should be stoned to death and her Jewish lover should be executed. The scholars protested the judgment, and it was never repeated. See Encyclopedia of the Ottoman Empire, G. Agnoston and B. Masters, New York, 2008, page 214. Why was this? This was because the evidentiary bar that the Sharia has for adultery is so high that it cannot possibly be met unless people voluntarily confess or deliberately go out of their way to be publicly seen in the act, in which case the act is one of religious and social sedition, not of passion. Specifically, the evidentiary bar is that 4 male witnesses of upright character and with no criminal record of even minimal offence must come forward within a month and testify under oath that they directly witnessed interpenetration, which is physically very difficult to actually see. If they differ on details of the event, such as the colour of the clothes worn, their testimony is rejected. If the witnesses were willingly, deliberately watching, they are no longer upright, and so effectively they have to see the act by accident and insist on telling. And if only 3 witnesses step forward, they are considered liars and are themselves flogged for slander. Not much incentive for coming forward. Moreover, film evidence nowadays is not permissible as proof, since this can, theoretically, be forged. Even pregnancy in the case of an absent husband is not proof of adultery, because, although highly unlikely, a woman can get pregnant accidentally in a shared bathroom. In fact, as improbable as this sounds, a case like this was clinically proven in Jordan at the beginning of the 20th century. In the Prophet's own time, though one of his companions, Hilal bin Umayyah, accused his wife of adultery, and her child was later shown by genetic signs not to be Hilal's child, this was not taken as proof of adultery. Moreover, the only recorded cases of stoning in the Prophet's own time were due to unsolicited and unwanted voluntary confessions. even after a confession, someone can withdraw their confession and avoid the penalty, even if it has already started. In short, adultery is a capital crime in theory and in the Shariah, but it is all but impossible to prove, and a hostile accusation has never fairly been proven in Islamic history. This is not a result of un-Islamic legal obfuscation by merciful jurists. It is actually the Sunnah, for the Prophet himself repeatedly turned away or tried to deflect people who wanted to confess. So procedures and conditions are meant to soften or ward off the punishments. A jurist is supposed to exert himself to avoid corporal or capital punishment as much as possible. 2, err on the side of pardoning and not err on the side of punishing. And 3, suspend any punishment in the presence of the slightest doubt. All this is an integral part of the how of the law. The Prophet said, "Ward off capital and corporal punishments, had, as much as you can." That's Hadith in Tirmidhi, Hakim et al. And ward off capital punishments through ambiguities. That's in Sunan al-Bayhaqi. In the Quran, we see that even on the day of judgment, and despite the fact that God is omniscient, there are all sorts of judicial procedures and witnesses brought against souls, showing that even in the next world, fair procedures are inseparable from justice. So, all these jihadi terrorists who today, as soon as they grab a foothold in some war-ravaged territory, start stoning women for adultery and broadcasting it on YouTube, and think they are pious for doing so, show only their barbarism and their profound ignorance of both the letter and the spirit of the Shariah. Why then is there this law in the first place? God says in the Quran that he frightens people in order that they may fear him for their own good. That is what God frightens his servants with. So, O servants of mine, fear me. Chapter Al-Zumar 39:16. So Rumi commentated in his Mathnawi, "It is from loving kindness that he terrifies you, that he may seat you in the kingdom of security." We said earlier that all the legislations of the Quran can be traced to the 5 aims of the Shariah, the Maqasid al-Shariah. Clearly, the punishment for adultery is to deter people for their own good in order to protect the most fundamental institution of society, the family. So the de jure punishment for adultery relates to protecting the universal right to family, procreation and honour. After all, it is very easy to get divorced in Islam, and if adultery were permitted, that would be the end of the family and the beginning of the dissolution of Islamic society as a whole. Finally, it should be noted that capital punishments can be frozen under certain conditions when it would be unfair to implement them, and there are laws that can be suspended by the ruler's authority. In the year of famine and plague in 638 to 639, the Caliph Umar exempted people from the payment of jizya and froze the corporal punishment for theft. Specifically, Usuli jurists have said that there are no capital punishments in A. non-Muslim lands, B. in travelling during war, C. when people do not know the rulings, D. when there is no legitimate ruler, E. when there are any doubts surrounding the circumstances, and F. when they cause far more harm than benefit. In short, Sharia punishments are not meant to be tyrannical, but to deter crime and ensure justice. Until next time.